This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning, Rabbi. So I just want to speak out a few inyanim regarding the Sukkah, but it's really one thematic subject, and actually a very interesting topic. I'm going to say we once spoke about this subject, but Ein Beis HaMedrash B'li Chidush, a few very interesting chidushim. Firstly, if we go to the end at number 29, there's a Rokeach. The Rokeach speaks about the following subject. We know there's a machlokes Tanaim about what do Sukkos commemorate. Do they commemorate the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory, or do they commemorate Sukkos Mamish, actual booths? So if it commemorates the clouds of glory, I understand why we make a Yom Tov to commemorate the miracle. It's very reasonable to commemorate a miracle that the Rebbeinu Shem performed for us. But if it's just commemorating the booths that we used when we were leaving Mitzrayim, why would we make a Yom Tov to commemorate those booths? You know, I can understand you want to make a Yom Tov to commemorate the actual homes Klal Yisrael lived in when they entered Eretz Yisrael, but this was like some kind of makeshift homeless shelters, basically. Why would we make a Yom Tov to commemorate these temporary shelters that Klal Yisrael lived in when they left Mitzrayim? So the Rokeach, he says that Sukkos Mamish do not commemorate these booths that Klal Yisrael lived in when they left Mitzrayim, but when they set siege on the Emoiri, in the lands of Sichon and Og, and all of those other villages on the Transjordan, during those wars, which were, by the way, the first wars Klal Yisrael waged when they fought to enter Eretz Yisrael, then they lived in these huts. In other words, these were like the army huts that Klal Yisrael lived in when they waged war, when they made their siege against the various cities of the Emorim Me'ibra Hayarden. Like the pasuk says, that Klal Yisrael lived in Sukkos then. And the pasuk says, we're commemorating the booths they lived in when they left Mitzrayim. This is all included in Yetzias Mitzrayim. Until they entered Eretz Yisrael, it was still considered Yetzias Mitzrayim, and this was in the 40th year. So it's very interesting that we would specifically be commemorating the booths that the Jewish people lived in when they were setting siege to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Like, why is that so interesting, and why is that so important to commemorate? I saw a comment in Rav Nachman of Breslov. He said a very interesting thing. He says that when Yaakov Avinu, before he came to Eretz Yisrael, to Shechem, the first stop he made was Yaakov Nasa Sukkos. So before Yaakov came into Eretz Yisrael, he went to Sukkos. Interesting. Likewise, when Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim to come to Eretz Yisrael, the first stop was Sukkos. Interesting that the route to take to get to Eretz Yisrael is Sukkos. That's how you get there. You travel through Sukkos. That's definitely also of note. Okay, so we're going to go to the beginning now. There is a custom, and I saw a misquote of the custom. The custom, take it for what it is. There is a custom to hang the Shivas Haminim in the Sukkah. Now, I've seen that this was brought in the name of the Taz. The Taz doesn't say this. The Taz never said it. The Taz says other things. So some of the Svarim that quoted the Taz's other things, quoted the Taz and quoted this minhag. And then the later Svarim, they quote everything from the Taz. But there's such a custom to hang up the 7 species with which Eretz Yisrael is praised with. What's the Indian of hanging up, for those who have this custom, the Shivas Haminim in the Sukkah? Okay, I'm going to tell you a Masorah we have, that it is no longer in our editions of the Psikta. Psikta is one of the Midrashim. But the Rishonim who quote the Psikta, they bring that they had this Gersa in the Psikta, and that is, if you look at number 2, the pasuk says, Chag HaSukkos Ta'aseh Lecha Shivas Yamim. The festival of Sukkos you should make for yourself. Now we know in Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh, when you have a future tense, Taf means you. But it could have 2 meanings. It could mean you should, and it could mean you will. So the simple meaning is, Chag HaSukkos Ta'aseh Lecha, you should make Sukkos. But it could also have a meaning you will make Sukkos. Reb Chaim Falaji and the Kaf HaChaim and the Abarbanel and the Ran, they all bring down a tradition that there's a haftacha, that if you sit in the Sukkah this year, you will sit in the Sukkah next year. If you look in the Reb Chaim Falaji, look at number 3. Ve'hachein ve'abita bepsikta. It says, Chag HaSukkos tasa im asisa kein achshav yihi ratzon shetasa kein l'shana acheres. V'darshu kein, because it says tasa and it doesn't say aseh. Could have said Chag HaSukkos aseh l'cha, but it says tasa. There's a haftacha. If you sit in the sukkah tafshin pei, you will sit in that. It's not saying only you should sit in the sukkah. It's saying if you do, you will do it next year. So in other words, now the question is, so if you sit in the sukkah this year, you'll live forever. Because if you sit in the sukkah this year, you have haftacha, you sit there next year. And if you sit next year, you have haftacha. The answer is yes. Sitting in the sukkah is a haftacha for arichas yamim. In fact, the Abarbanel brings down, how do we make such a drasha, Chag HaSukkos taselecha, that if you sit in the sukkah this year, you'll be zocheh to sit next year? Like when the Malachim came to Abraham and they said, Kain ta'aseh ka'asher dibarta. What they were saying to Abraham is, not only will you feed us this year, you will feed us next year at the bris of Yitzchak Avinu. Likewise, so there we see ta'aseh means, you will feed us again. So too, if you sit in the sukkah this year, you will feed us next year. In fact, the Sifrei Chasidus write, there's only one mitzvah in the Torah that it says Ezrach. Sukkah, kol ha'ezrach v'Yisrael yeshivu b'Sukkos. The word Ezrach, what does it mean kol ha'ezrach? Ezrach means an old man. In fact, the gematria of the word Ezrach is 216, Gevura. That if somebody sits in the sukkah, they will reach the age of Gevurais, which is 80 years old. Now, obviously, there are no guarantees, right? There are no absolute guarantees, but again, we see there's a haftacha that sitting in the sukkah is a schus for a long life. Why would that be? What is it about the sukkah that gives you long life? The air is better in the sukkah somehow than somewhere else. Why does sitting in the sukkah give you long life? Another tradition. Rav Chaim Falaji writes in the Sefer Moed L'Chol Chai that the minimum walls of the sukkah has to be 3 walls. 3 walls is vav, vav, vav. What's the gematria of vav, vav, vav? Chai. A haftacha that if you sit in the sukkah, chai, you'll live long. Why are you going to live long? Another question. God tells the Jewish people when we're leaving Mitzrayim, v'hoitzesi esam mitaras avos Mitzrayim, v'itzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti. And He did all that. He took us out of Mitzrayim. He saved us. He redeemed us, and He took us as His people. But one thing He did not do is v'hevesi. He never brought us to Eretz Yisroel. Yeah, ultimately He brought us to Eretz Yisroel. But those 600,000 Jews, they all passed away, and they never entered Eretz Yisroel. So that promise, asked the Tfar Shlomo, seems to have been unfulfilled. Says the pasuk, Leman yedu doiroisechem kivasukais hoishavti es bnei Yisrael b'hoitzi oisam eretz Mitzrayim ani Hashem Elokeichem. I am Hashem your God. Really? I never knew that. It's a big chiddush. Hashem's our God. Why da? You say that by every mitzvah. Daven in the morning, I'm your God. Put on tefillin, I'm your God. Why does Rebbeinu Shalom specifically say by the mitzvah of Sukkah, Ani Hashem Elokeichem? No. So here's the point here. We're going to uncover a very remarkable dimension of the mitzvah of Sukkah, and that is the Sefer Tzemach David, who's actually the son of the Bnei Yissaschar, brings the concept that Rabbi Yochanan was told they're old people in Bavel. So Rabbi Yochanan said, it's impossible. It says, L'man yirbu yimechem al ha'adama. You can only live long in Eretz Yisrael. So they said, no! In Bavel, they come early to shul and they stay late. That's why they live long. So the Marsha asks, very nice, they come early to shul and live and stay late. But the pasuk says you only live long in Eretz Yisrael. So how could you live long in Bavel? So the Marsha explains, it must be that a shul has in it kedushas Eretz Yisrael. And when you breathe in the air of the shul, you're literally breathing in avira da'ara. And the same way, if you live in Eretz Yisrael, you live long. If you stay in a shul, you come early, you stay late, you live long, says the Marsha. We see from this Gemara, a Yesod, that a shul has the status of Eretz Yisrael. To the point where I saw in a Tshuva Sefer, that if you plant a tree in a shul, you might be chayv in Shuvas HaMaisros. It's not just the agarata. Anybody that wants to wash and bench, don't make a leishe b'sukkah. Yeah. So there's a concept that a shul has kedushas Eretz Yisrael in it, because the Maharsha explains, since ultimately the shuls will be uprooted and go to Eretz Yisrael, even now they have the status of Eretz Yisrael. Go wash. Fine, go wash. So now, by the same token, says the Tzemach David, that just like a shul has the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, a sukkah has the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael in it. When you're sitting in a sukkah, it's literally like living in the Holy Land. Therefore, we know, it says anyone who lives in Eretz Yisrael, it's like he has a God, the Gemara in Sukkah says. Remember this Gemara? The Gemara says, Kol hadar be'Eretz Yisrael, kemi sheyesh lo yeleka. V'chol she'eno hadar be'Eretz Yisrael, kemi she'en lo yeleka. One who lives in Israel, it's like he has a God. One who doesn't live in Israel, it's like he doesn't have a God. So now says the Tzemach David, we understand why the pasuk says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am Hashem your God. Because in the Sukkah, even if you live in the 5 towns where during the rest of the year it's like you have no God, but during the festival, or even if you live in West Hempstead, if you live in the Sukkah during those days, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am Hashem your God. Now what does it mean that if you live in Eretz Yisrael it's like you have a God, and if you live outside of Eretz Yisrael it's like you have no God? It's a very harsh statement. What does the Gemara mean? It's a Gemara Mefureshes and Ksubas. So again, the Maharsha explains that in Eretz Yisrael, God deals with Klal Yisrael with no intermediary, with no go-between. It's just Rebbeinu Shalom and Klal Yisrael. So we have a God, meaning we deal directly with God. In Chutz La'aretz, the Rebbeinu Shalom deals with these lands through Malachim, through Sarim, through angels, through intermediaries. So it's like we have no God. Chas v'shalom doesn't mean we don't have a God, but the connection is somewhat more remote. But when you're in the Sukkah, you're directly under the shade of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're directly in the Tzila de Mehemenusa, and it's like you have a God the same as if you're living in Eretz Yisrael. Okay. So I want to show you something amazing. So now we're learning that here it is, you're sitting in your backyard, you're in the 5 towns, you're in Williamsburg, you're in Muncie, you're in Borough Park, and typically when you sit in your backyard, you're sitting in an area where you're remote. You and the Rebbeinu Shalom, there is some level of disconnect. And yet when you sit in your sukkah, it's like being in Yerushalayim, it's like being in Eretz Yisrael. Even better. Nach Beser. So now listen to this. There's a famous tradition from the Gemara that there are only 2 mitzvahs in the Torah that a Jew could be mekayim with his whole body, with all 248 limbs, with all your sinews. There are only 2 mitzvahs that you could enter with your entire being. What are the 2 mitzvahs that you could enter with your entire being? The Gemara says, Eretz Yisrael and Sukkah. The Sifrei Chasidus say it's the only mitzvah you could go in even with the mud on your boots. And the Gemara would say, if you look at number 16, that there's a remes to this. It says, Lam natseach b'neginois, mizmar shel asav shir, noida b'huda elikim, b'yisrael gadash mai, vayihi b'shalem sukai, uma'inasai b'tzion. So the Gemara would say, vayihi b'shalem, when could you do a mitzvah b'shleimus? With all 248 limbs, with all 365 sinews. Sukai, either you're in the sukkah, or uma'inasai b'tzion, or when you're in Sion. There are 2 ways to do a mitzvah with your whole body. Either in the sukkah, or when you're in Sion. So the Mefarshim ask on this Gra, there's one more mitzvah, l'chayra, you could do with all your body. Mikvah. Yeah? So they say, I saw 2 terutzim. One teretz is, there's no mitzvah to go to the mikvah. No, I'm not talking about a man. I'm talking in general, in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when you needed it for Tara, it was only a hechsher mitzvah for achilas kosher. It wasn't an actual mitzvah. It only prepared you to be able to do a mitzvah. The Kesef Mishnah says that actually you're not even tahar when you're in the mikvah. You're not tahar until you pop out. So the truth is, the entering of the mitzvah, of the mikvah, is not entering a chefza shel mitzvah, because you're not even tahar until you come out of the mikvah. But be it as it may, it comes out that there are 2 mitzvahs that a person is mekayim with their whole body. Vayhi b'shalem, when can you do a mitzvah b'shleimus, says the Gra? Either sukkah, either when you're in the sukkah, or b'tzion. But according to what we're saying, there's only 1 mitzvah that you can do with your whole body. Living in Eretz Yisrael. But there happens to be another way to get there. Ordinarily, you gotta pay now, what is it, $1,800 to get there. today, right? Or probably more. By the way, if you go Cholamoid, people go Cholamoid, it's cheaper. You could save $800. That's no cost for that piece of advice, right? So now the new thing is people go Erev Yom Kippur and they come back for the second days, right? Also, they save money. But the truth is, the one Yom Tif, you might not need to go to Eretz Yisrael, is Sukkos. Pesach, maybe you should take a go. Shavuos, but Sukkos, it's a shaila whether it's a mitzvah of aliyah l'regel. Even today, the Chassam Sofer says there is. Then you would have to go. Actually, it's not a mitzvah chiyuvis b'zman hazeh. But be it as it may, according to what we're saying, there are two ways to be in Eretz Yisrael. Either to actually be in Eretz Yisrael, but another way to be in Eretz Yisrael is what? By being in the Sukkah. Being in the Sukkah is tantamount to being in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore we find kol ha'ezrach, living in the Sukkah is a skula for arichas yamim. Because just like being in Eretz Yisrael is l'man yirbu yimechem al ha'adama, being in the Sukkah is actually like being in Eretz Yisrael. By the way, this is another very nice gra. The gra said, that Avraham Avinu was mekayim all the mitzvahs before they were given. So they asked the gra, how do we know he sat in the Sukkah? So the gra said Pashat. It says V'Avram, V'Hashem berachas Avraham, B'Koil. God blessed Avraham with everything. B'Koil stands for Bis Sukkos Teishu Shavas Yamim, Kol Ha'ezrach V'Yisrael Yisru Sukkos, Leman Yedu Doroi Seichem. But it's interesting. That's how we know Avraham kept the Sukkah. It's the gra. But what does it say in that context? Va'Avraham zokein ba ba'yamim va'Hashem berachas ba'koil. In the context that Avraham kept the Sukkah is the pasuk that Avraham lived a long life. Like we're saying, because the mitzvah of Sukkah is the school of Harichas Yamim. So there's a sefer of Ramazim. It's unbelievable remez. I heard of this sefer from Rav Pinchas Friedman, the Rosh Kollel of Belz. He says a very interesting sefer is one of pre-war gadol in Europe. And according to what we're saying, what is a sukkah? A sukkah is basically condensing the borders of Eretz Yisrael into your little hut. What is a sukkah called? Diras Arai. You ready for this? Says Rab Shem Klingberg that if a sukkah are the four borders of Eretz Yisrael, what are the borders of Eretz Yisrael? Where does it say in Mishnayos the borders of Eretz Yisrael? In the beginning of Gittin, the first Mishnah in Gittin, right? So what are the borders of Eretz Yisrael? It says Ashkelon Litzafai, Ashkelon Ladaraim, Ashkelon Kedarim, Akoy Litzafai, Akoy Kitzafai, Rekem Mimizrach, Rekem Kimizrach. And what's the western border? The Yam. What's a sukkah? Diras Arai. Arai stands for Ashkelon, Rekem, Akoy, Yam. The four borders of Eretz Yisrael. The four borders of Eretz Yisrael. Sukkah is Diras Arai. It's a Mishnah in Gittin. Ashkelon, Rekem, Akoy, Yam. Those are the four borders of Eretz Yisrael. Exactly what we're saying. That what? That the sukkah is literally a microcosm of Eretz Yisrael. We're condensing the borders of Eretz Yisrael into our very own sukkah. So I would like to suggest, why are we zoichet to such a gift this time of the year, that Hashem takes Eretz Yisrael and allows us to bring all of Kedushas Haaretz into our backyard? I stumbled across an Abarbanel. Abarbanel says there are three festivals, three chagim, and the three chagim celebrate three gifts that God gave us. Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos, yeah? Pesach celebrates Yetzias Mitzrayim. What are the three gifts? That Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, that He gave us the Torah, and that He gave us Eretz Yisrael. Pesach celebrates Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. Shavuos celebrates what? God gave us the Torah. And says Abarbanel, what's Sukkos? Celebration that the Rebbeinu Shem gave us, Eretz Yisrael. Right? So Pesach celebrates Yetzias Mitzrayim, Shavuos that He gave us the Torah, and Sukkot Hashem gave us Eretz Yisrael. So perhaps that is the reason why on the Yom Tov of Sukkot, which is a celebration of the great gift of Eretz Yisrael, Hashem says, not only do we celebrate Eretz Yisrael, I will give you the Matana Toiva, that when you're in your Sukkah, The Sukkah is literally a microcosm of Eretz Yisrael. Ani Hashem Elokeichem. Just like in Eretz Yisrael, I am your direct God without an intermediary. When we sit in the Sukkah, we're sitting under the shade of Hashem without an intermediary. It's Diras Arai, Ashkelon, Rekem, Akoy, Yam. Maybe we could suggest two chidushim. I always wondered, if Sukkah is commemorating Ananei HaKavod like we mentioned, I understand why we want to commemorate Ananei HaKavod. Why would we want to commemorate the actual booths that the Jewish people sat in when they left Mitzrayim? So we saw the Rekeach says, no, we're not celebrating the actual booths they sat in when they left Mitzrayim. We're celebrating the booths they made when they set siege on the lands of Sichon and Og. And that boggles the mind. Why in the world would we have a Yom Tov to commemorate the booths that they sat in when they set siege on Eretz Sichon and Og? But maybe according to what we're saying, that Sukkos is a celebration of Eretz Yisrael, so we commemorate the very first kibush of Eretz Yisrael, which was conquering the lands of Sichon and Og. So we sort of reminisce and we reenact the historic battles that we had when we conquered the Ever LeYarden. Because according to the Manda Amar Sukkos Mamish, we're not commemorating booths we sat in when we left Mitzrayim originally, but in the year 40 when we began to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi, could it be then that one of the things we do on Sukkot is we go around the Bima over the course of 7 days, 7 times. And on Hoshana Rabbah itself, we go around the Bima 7 times. Why do we go around the Bima 7 times? So if you look in the Mefarshim, the Rishonim, the Torah, because when they conquered Yerichai, they encircled it 7 times. And you just take it for granted. Yeah, so now on Sukkot, I'm randomly going around the Bima 7 times, because when they conquered Yerichai, they went around. What does Sukkot got to do with conquering Yerichai? Maybe, again, since Yerichai was the very first city that they conquered, when they conquered Eretz Yisrael. And what is Sukkot? A celebration that the Rebbe Shalom gave us Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, we also go around the Bima 7 times to commemorate the way in which Eretz Yisrael was conquered, the very first city. Says Abarbanel, why is Sukkot 7 days? Keneged, the 7 species with which Eretz Yisrael is nishtabeach by. And maybe that would explain the custom that some have to hang up the Shivas Haminim in the Sukkah. So, one more idea from Rav Nachman of Breslov. Rav Nachman just points out, that every time Klal Yisrael is about to enter Eretz Yisrael, they first go to Sukkos. When Yaakov Avinu returned to Eretz Yisrael, Yaakov Nasa, Sukkosa. When Klal Yisrael were leaving Mitzrayim, their first stop was Sukkos. Also, it seems like Sukkos has this shemetz, it has a semblance of Eretz Yisrael. It's next stop Eretz Yisrael proper. Next stop Eretz Yisrael proper. It's like a microcosm of Eretz Yisrael. Maybe that's why we daven. Harachaman hu yakim lanu asukas David hanoifoles. Rebbe Hashem, you're giving us a microcosm of Eretz Yisrael. You're giving us a me'ain of Eretz Yisrael. Please bring us to the real thing. Please erect the real thing. Please help us build the real thing. And one more idea I think that fits very well into what we're suggesting is the Belzer Rebbe explains the Torah. The Torah tells us that the 3 avos correspond to the 3 Yamim Tovim. Pesach corresponds to Abraham because Abraham served the Archim on Pesach. Shavuos corresponds to Yitzchak because the shofar of Matan Torah was from the Isle of Yitzchak. And Yaakov corresponds to Sukkos. So the Belzer Rebbe said, why does Yaakov correspond to Sukkos? Because Yaakov Avinu is Kedushas Eretz Yisrael in a different place. Think about it. Yaakov goes to Beisel. He goes to the north. He realized he missed Yerushalayim, so he starts heading back to Yerushalayim. What happens? Eretz Yisrael comes to him. Eretz Yisrael moves to him. Yaakov represents Eretz Yisrael shaloi b'mekaymai. Kedushas Eretz Yisrael shaloi b'mekaymai. Yaakov Avinu could be somewhere else, and Eretz Yisrael says, I'm going to come to Yaakov Avinu. That's the predecessor of the concept of the Sukkah, which is we could be in Chutz Aretz, we could be Far Darban in the Galus, and for a few days a year, the Rebbe Shalom says, just like Yaakov Avinu, Eretz Yisrael went to him, for a few days a year, I will bring Eretz Yisrael to you. Why? We're saying that, from the Abarbanel, that Sukkos is a celebration of the great gift of Eretz Yisrael. Pesach celebrates Yetzias Mitzrayim, Shavuos celebrates Matan Torah, and Sukkah celebrates the gift of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the Rebbeinu Shalom gives us a microcosm of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore Rebbeinu Shalom tells us, Chag HaSukkos Ta'aseh Lecha, which is a tradition that we have, that the Psikta says that if you sit in the Sukkah this year, you will sit in the Sukkah next year. Why is that? Because the Sukkah is Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. And Laman Yirbu Yemechem Al Ho'adama. When you're in the Sukkah, you're literally breathing in the Avira Da'ara. It's Vayhi B'Shalem Sukkah Umaynasei B'Tzion. That there are two mitzvahs you can do with your whole body, but in a certain way, it's really one mitzvah, and that is the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, which Rebbeinu Shalom gives us a taste of during the next 7 days. So we should be zoicha to fulfill the mitzvah of Yeshiva Sukkah properly, and we should be zoicha to Arichas Yamim and the bracha of Kol HaEzrach B'Yisrael Yeshvu B'Sukkos. Shkoyach, Agut Yom Tov.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.